Chris Cornell's former home in Los Angeles, California, has become the subject of eerie tales since his tragic passing in 2017. Nestled in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, the house, with its mid-century modern design and sweeping views of the city, was once a place of creativity and solace for the late Soundgarden and Audioslave frontman. But now, fans and locals claim the property harbors an unsettling energy. In the months following Cornell's death, visitors to the area began sharing chilling accounts. Many described hearing faint echoes of music at odd hours, soft, melancholic guitar riffs and haunting vocal melodies that seemed to float on the night air. Some fans, leaving flowers and tributes near the property's gates, spoke of an inexplicable sense of being watched or even overwhelmed with emotion, as if the grief of the house itself was pressing down on them. One particularly eerie story comes from a woman who visited the site late at night. As she stood near the driveway, she claimed to hear a deep, raspy voice whisper, "I'm still here." Turning around, she saw no one, but her phone, which she had been using to take photos, suddenly shut off. When it restarted, the photos she had taken near the house were mysteriously blurred or distorted. Neighbors have also reported unsettling occurrences. A man living nearby claimed to see a shadowy figure pacing back and forth near the home's large windows. The figure, tall and lean, bore a resemblance to Cornell himself. When the man approached to get a closer look, the figure vanished. One peculiar detail involves a large tree on the property, which Cornell reportedly loved for its unique, wind-like rustling. After his death, locals say the tree emits faint sounds resembling whispers or singing, even on windless nights. Some fans believe this is a spiritual manifestation of his music, blending into the natural world. While many chalk these stories up to grief-stricken imaginations or coincidence, others are convinced that Cornell's spirit lingers in the home he once loved. Fans who visited say the experiences, though unsettling, are not malicious. Instead, they describe a presence that feels heavy with sorrow, yet infused with the creativity and passion that defined his life. One night, a group of friends decided to visit the area after hearing the rumors. They arrived just before midnight, armed with their phones and a portable speaker playing some of Cornell's most famous tracks. As they approached the edge of the property, the music on their speaker began to distort. His haunting vocals slowed unnaturally, then warped into silence. Startled, they checked the device, but it appeared to be functioning normally. Still, they pressed on, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and unease. One of them swore they saw a faint light flickering in an upstairs window, though the house had long been unoccupied. Another insisted they heard the distant hum of a bass line, so faint it could have been mistaken for the city's ever-present noise, except it seemed to sync perfectly with the rhythm of their own quickening heartbeats. As they circled closer to the gates, the temperature inexplicably dropped. A sudden gust of wind carried with it the faint scent of cigarette smoke and the unmistakable aroma of leather, the kind Cornell was known to favor in his wardrobe. They exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Then came the voice, soft, melodic, and undeniably familiar. It wasn't singing, not exactly, but rather a fragmented hum, like the ghost of a song searching for completion. The group froze. One of them, a lifelong fan, called out, "Chris? Is that you?" The humming stopped. Silence blanketed the street, so thick it seemed to muffle even the distant sounds of traffic from Sunset Boulevard. Then came the reply, low and guttural, almost like a growl. "Go back." Panic surged through them, and as they turned to flee, one of their phones began ringing. The screen displayed an unknown number, but the ringtone wasn't theirs. It was "Fell on Black Days." The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet street, and the phone wouldn't stop ringing no matter how many times they tried to silence it. When they finally reached the safety of their car, they sat in stunned silence, too shaken to speak. It wasn't until they drove away that one of them noticed their wrist bruised, as if someone had grabbed it with an iron grip. "I didn't feel it happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. As the group shared their story in the days that followed, they learned they weren't the only ones to experience such events. But one detail stood out, a figure that appeared in the backgrounds of photos taken by others who had visited the property. The silhouette of a man, often blurred but unmistakably tall, his presence haunting the edges of every frame. To this day, they can't explain what they encountered. And the ringing phone? The call log showed no record of it ever happening. Weeks later, one of the friends, Mia, couldn't shake the experience. She began to dig deeper into the stories surrounding Cornell's house, convinced there was a pattern they'd missed. Late one evening, while scrolling through online forums, she stumbled upon a thread filled with similar accounts. But one post, buried among hundreds, caught her attention. It was written by someone named E. The post was cryptic, warning readers to stay away from the house and claiming that the strange occurrences were not merely the echoes of a grieving spirit, but something darker. "He's not alone," it read. "There's something else tied to that place, something feeding off the pain. If you hear the voice, don't answer it. If you see the figure, don't acknowledge it. You'll invite it closer." The warning sent a chill down Mia's spine, but curiosity overruled her fear. She replied to the thread, asking for more information. Hours later, as she sat in her dimly lit apartment, her phone buzzed with a notification. It wasn't a reply to her post, it was a direct message. The sender's username was unfamiliar, and the message consisted of only one line. "Do you hear the music yet?" Mia stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. She hadn't mentioned the music in her post. The air in her apartment seemed heavier suddenly, and she realized the room had gone deathly quiet. No hum of the refrigerator, no distant city noise, just silence. Then faintly she heard it, a low, haunting melody, like a guitar string being plucked over and over. The sound wasn't coming from her phone or any nearby device. It was emanating from somewhere outside. Against her better judgment, Mia stepped to the window and looked out. The street was empty except for a figure standing under the lone street lamp. Tall and cloaked in shadow, the figure seemed to turn toward her, though its features were indiscernible. And then the music stopped. Her phone buzzed again, jolting her. This time it was a photo attachment from the same anonymous sender. She opened it reluctantly, her hands trembling. The image showed her own apartment building, taken from outside. But the timestamp was impossible. It was dated 3 minutes into the future. Mia's breath hitched as she glanced at the clock. The exact moment from the timestamp was approaching. Her mind raced. Was someone watching her? Was it the figure outside? Her phone buzzed one more time, and a new message appeared. "If you leave now, it might let you go." And then her lights flickered. A shadow passed behind her, reflected in the glass of the window. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Mia spun around, her heart pounding, but her apartment was empty, or so it seemed. She backed away from the window, clutching her phone tightly. The faint melody started again, but now it sounded closer, as though it were playing just beyond the walls of her home. Her breaths came shallow and fast as she stared at the time on her phone. It had reached the exact moment marked on the photo's timestamp. The knock came then, soft but deliberate. 3 slow taps on her front door. Mia froze. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and the building's entrance required a key code. Nobody should have been able to get up there without buzzing in. The knock came again, more insistent this time. She edged closer to the door, her mind racing. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway, empty and silent. Her phone buzzed again. She flinched, nearly dropping it, and glanced at the screen. Another message had appeared from the anonymous sender. "It's already inside." Mia's stomach dropped. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for movement. She checked the locks on her windows, peered into the shadows of her kitchen, her bathroom, her closet, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Desperate for answers, she typed back to the sender, "Who are you? What does it want?" The reply came almost instantly. "It doesn't want you. It wants to finish what he started." Before she could make sense of the message, her phone screen flickered and went black. At the same moment, the soft guitar notes swelled, impossibly loud, as if an invisible amplifier had been cranked to full volume. The walls of her apartment seemed to vibrate with the sound. The air turned cold, and the faint scent of leather and smoke filled the room, just as it had near Cornell's house. Then came a whisper, just behind her ear. "Sing it with me." Mia whirled around, her back against the wall, but the room remained empty. Her pulse thundered as she pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the sound. The melody shifted, becoming jagged and discordant, like a song breaking apart mid-verse. It was then that she noticed something strange. The shadows in the room were moving, stretching unnaturally toward her, drawn by the sound. Her phone buzzed once more, vibrating against the floor where she had dropped it. The screen lit up with a new message from the unknown sender. This one was just a single word, stark and final. "Run." But as she reached for the door, the guitar melody abruptly stopped. A deafening silence fell over the room. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. The air felt charged, electric, like the calm before a storm. And then, slowly, she heard it, a low, gravelly voice humming the same fragmented tune, coming from the shadows behind her. She turned, and this time, something was there. The figure in the shadows didn't fully emerge but seemed to ripple, as if the darkness itself had taken shape. Its outline flickered, shifting between a tall, human-like silhouette and something more twisted, more fragmented. It stepped closer, the soft hum now layered with what sounded like distorted whispers, voices overlapping, rising and falling like waves crashing in reverse. Mia's breath hitched, her legs trembling, but she couldn't move. The figure wasn't just watching her, it was studying her. She could feel its focus, an oppressive weight pressing into her mind, peeling back layers of memory and thought. Her childhood, her fears, her fleeting joys, all of it flashed before her eyes in a disjointed cascade, as if it was sifting through her very essence. The phone buzzed again. It lay at her feet, vibrating furiously, the light from the screen casting harsh shadows on her face. Another message from the unknown sender had appeared. "Don't let it finish the song." The humming grew louder, the tune now unmistakable, an unfinished melody from a Soundgarden song that Cornell had been rumored to write but never recorded. A lost piece of his legacy, left behind and forgotten until now. Mia's mind raced. Was this him? Or was it something else using his presence, his music, as a doorway? The figure paused, its shadowy head tilting as though listening to her thoughts. It didn't approach further, but the room seemed to constrict around her, the walls bending inward. The melody shifted again, breaking into a dissonant chord, like a guitar string snapping. And then it spoke, not in a whisper, but in a deep, resonant voice that felt like it was coming from inside her own skull. "Help me finish it." The words sent a jolt of cold fear through her. Finish it? She thought back to the stories, the warnings. If she answered, if she gave it what it wanted, what would happen? But before she could decide, her hand moved on its own, trembling, reaching for the phone. Her fingers grazed the screen, and the message thread reopened. A video file had appeared at the top of the chat. It autoplayed before she could stop it. The footage was grainy, black and white, as if recorded on an old security camera. It showed Chris Cornell himself, sitting alone in a dimly lit room, strumming a guitar. The melody he played was hauntingly familiar, but his face was wrong. The shadows clung to him, twisting and writhing, obscuring his features. He stopped playing and looked directly at the camera, directly at her, as if he knew she was watching. His mouth moved, forming silent words, but the file cut out before she could understand. Her apartment lights flickered violently, the shadows growing longer, and she realized the humming wasn't just in her head, it was resonating through the walls, through the floor, vibrating her very bones. The figure took another step forward, and the room seemed to tilt as though reality itself was slipping. Her phone buzzed one last time. Another message. The song isn't his anymore. And then her screen went dark. Mia's heart raced, the darkness pressing in on her from every side. The oppressive silence that followed the phone's sudden blackout was almost worse than the hum. For a moment, she couldn't even hear her own breath, as though the very air had been sucked from the room. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic tapping of her heartbeat in her ears, so loud it almost drowned out the faint melody that had begun again. The figure's presence was now palpable, more real than anything she had ever felt. Its form seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the song, warping with each note. It was no longer just a shadow, it had begun to solidify, growing clearer by the second. But there was something wrong with its shape. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, as if they were made of liquid darkness, flowing and twisting like smoke. The room felt smaller, claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in, drawing her closer to whatever that thing was. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, layering themselves over the music, thousands of voices speaking in frantic, unintelligible fragments. It was as though the song itself was trying to channel something from another place, a place beyond life, a place where time and memory didn't exist. The figure reached out with one long, gnarled hand, its fingers curving like claws, its touch barely brushing the air. Mia's body froze, her mind screaming to move, but she couldn't. The warmth of its presence seeped into her skin, cold but burning at the same time, and a cold breath whispered across her face. The voice in her head was back, stronger this time. Finish it. The words were not a request. They were a demand, a need, as if the very fabric of the world would unravel if she refused. Mia staggered back, her legs buckling beneath her as she tried to break free from the pull of the figure's gaze. Her phone had died. Her lights were flickering, spasming with the rhythm of the haunting melody that had now overtaken the room. The music, it wasn't just coming from the figure anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as though the house itself had become a living instrument, reverberating with the raw energy of the song. And it was still unfinished. Mia's head spun. She remembered something from the forums, the warning about the song, how it was never meant to be completed, how Cornell himself had tried to bury it, leave it behind, but something had happened. Someone or something had kept trying to pull him back to it. The melody was a doorway, a key to something far darker than just grief or sorrow. Her fingers twitched, reaching for her phone again almost against her will. The urge to know, to understand, was overpowering. It was like a spell, an ancient pull that had been cast the moment she first crossed the threshold into this nightmare. As she grabbed the phone and turned it on, a new message flashed on the screen. "You are the last one." The words were followed by an attachment. A video file, this time with a thumbnail showing only a shadowed face, one that looked disturbingly familiar. Her hand trembled as she pressed play. The video opened in the same dimly lit room as before, but now Chris Cornell was not alone. There were other shadowy figures, indistinct, their forms twisting like the dark smoke that had formed the creature. The camera zoomed in on Cornell's face, his expression strained, his eyes bloodshot. His fingers were moving furiously across the strings of the guitar, his hands trembling. Then, the figure in the room, no, it was the thing, moved into view. It wasn't just watching him anymore. It was feeding on him. The song itself seemed to suck the very life from him as he played. His face twisted in agony, the shadows tightening around him. "Stop, please," he mouthed silently, but no sound came through. The hum of the melody grew louder, and in the background, Mia saw something move, something that wasn't just a figure. It was a presence, a form that could not be fully seen but was everywhere, pressing in on him. And then, the camera shook violently, as though someone had just grabbed it. The screen went black. Mia's heart thundered in her chest as the silence that followed seemed to suffocate her. Her phone buzzed. A final message from the sender. "It's inside you now." The walls of the apartment seemed to pulse with the song. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She glanced at the door, the hallway just beyond. The shadows in the room were no longer just shadows. They were alive, and they were closing in on her. "Sing it with me." The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just in her head now. It was coming from within her. Mia couldn't stop it. Her lips parted. The song was already slipping from her throat, echoing in the space between her words. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, she heard it answer. "Finish it." Mia's voice trembled, barely audible at first. But as if drawn by an invisible force, the melody poured from her, weak and fragile, like the remnants of a long-lost song. It was the same one Chris Cornell had played, the same haunting tune that had somehow become more than just music. It was a conduit, a doorway. Her heart raced as the song spilled out of her, the notes carried by something ancient and terrible. The walls of her apartment seemed to bend with the rhythm, stretching and warping, pulling her into another place. The figure, now fully formed, stood at the center of the room, its form twisting and flickering like a broken reflection in water. It seemed to absorb the song, feeding off her fear, her desperation. The melody was no longer just sound. It was a force that needed to be completed, a force that had been waiting for this moment for far too long. The figure stepped forward, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, shifting, swirling with darkness, pulling her in. Mia's voice faltered. She could feel the weight of the song pushing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. The shadows in the room thickened, reaching for her, crawling along the floor, the walls, like sentient things, moving with the rhythm of the melody. She knew she had to stop, but the song would not stop. It wasn't her singing anymore. It was the song that had found her. In a final burst of energy, she tried to close her mouth, to block the music, but it exploded out of her, louder and more urgent, as if she were no longer in control. The figure raised a hand, its fingers elongating into claws. It reached for her, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her toward it. The final note came, and in that instant the room cracked open. The shadows erupted, twisting into a violent vortex, consuming everything. The song had been completed. There was no scream, no sound at all. Just silence. Mia was gone. The apartment, once filled with the hum of the music, was now empty except for the guitar, still faintly humming as if it had a life of its own. Outside, the night was still quiet. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then, as if summoned by the very force of the song, a figure appeared on the street corner. It was a man, tall, his features obscured in shadow. His eyes were all that could be seen, dark and knowing. He stood still for a moment, staring up at the apartment window, where the flicker of the lights had long since faded. Then he turned and walked away. The music, now complete, had claimed its final victim. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.